Hi everyone and welcome back to Nomad Nation Shop Talk. I'm Dave and with us again today is Brantley, the owner of the 2012 Jeep JKU. Today is our second episode of our three-part series on maintenance. So be sure to subscribe and hit that bell so you don't miss any of our future videos.
So what topic are we covering today on maintenance?
Today we're going to be covering lubricating the chassis and the suspension. But before we do that, let's roll the intro.
So Dave, it's good to be back again on Shop Talk. And last week we talked about lubricating the engine with engine oil and regular maintenance with oil changes. So if you haven't actually watched that video, be sure to click the link below and check that one out. It's really worthwhile. Dave walks us through the entire process of how to change your own oil in your Jeep JK. Definitely check it out. But in this episode, you're wanting to talk about lubricating the chassis and the suspension.
That's right. It's one of the most important things you can do. It's very basic. Anytime you have metal on metal friction, you need to lubricate that to keep parts from excessive wear, to keep them from getting hot, and to prevent failure.
So what kind of components do we need to lubricate?
It varies from vehicle to vehicle, especially on Jeeps, what happens when you start doing upgrades. So from the factory, you can have a sealed chassis, which means you don't have to do any lubricating at all. If a chassis is sealed, it means that it's got the rubber boot on there that's pre-greased. In theory, it has no way of escaping. So they don't put any grease fittings on that. There are no, or Zerks, they're also known as. But on some components, they have the little grease fittings that you have to lubricate. It could be on your tie rods, it could be on your drag link, it could be on your control arms, it could be on, yours has grease fittings on the sway bar disconnects.
Yeah.
So anytime there's metal on metal, you want to keep that lubricated.
Okay, so if we see a grease fitting, and you called it a Zerk, so if we see one of those, that means we should probably lubricate it.
Yes.
Now, how often should we be doing this?
Every time you do your oil change.
Which in the last video you said shouldn't be more than 5,000 miles.
5,000 miles, yeah.
Gotcha.
And for the folks at home that do their own oil changes and their own basic maintenance, greasing the chassis is one of those things where you kind of have to pay attention to what you're doing because it's possible to over-grease something. So here at the shop, we don't use a pneumatic or a battery-operated grease gun.
Okay.
We use the old school manual pistol grip grease pumps.
Yeah, I've got the pistol grip grease pump at my house. I've had it for like 20 plus years. But whenever I was first taught to grease something, I was told you just keep pumping grease in there until you see it oozing out the sides. And once it starts oozing out the sides, you're done. Is that a good rule of thumb to follow?
Kind of. So when you're greasing your chassis or you're greasing a component, you want to be watching for that. And that is a stopping point once that happens. But first, you also want to do it by feel. When you're greasing your chassis or any component on your suspension, it shouldn't take more than 1 to maybe 4 or 5 pumps of grease to get the grease boot full. Okay. And as it continues to fill, the handle on your grease gun will get stiffer. Okay. And once it gets to the point where you actually have to apply a decent amount of pressure, stop.
Okay, so everything with a Zerk should be lubricated on a regular basis, and you're saying that regular basis should be pretty much every time you do an oil change.
That's right.
Now, what if I'm running off-road, like I'm doing Pee Wee's Crossing, and it's flooded down at S'more, and water's just rushing underneath the Jeep? Should I grease it sooner, or is it still okay to wait till the next oil change?
No, typically it's okay to wait till the next oil change, but that's up to each individual person to make sure that you're regularly checking these things. So between intervals, you still want to check to make sure that you haven't torn a grease boot or done some damage that would allow the grease to escape. So that question's kind of difficult to answer because it's on a...
It just depends.
It depends.
Yeah. Now, what kind of grease should you use? Because when I go to AutoZone or O'Reilly's or Advanced Auto Parts, there's just shelves full of all kinds of different grease for all kinds of different applications.
Yeah, it's just a general multi-purpose grease is all it is. Again, we use the Royal Purple brand, but there's lots of different brands and types out there. The red grease is it's red. Yeah. And so which is a multi-purpose, general purpose grease.
Okay. What kind of special tools do you need to actually do this yourself?
You just need a grease gun. They can be found at any local auto parts store. Hardware stores carry them. You can order them online. They range in price anywhere from about $15 up to 30 or 40 for a manual pistol grip grease gun.
Okay.
They come in couple of different sizes. We use the grease guns with the flexible hose, the easier to get to. Some of those Zerks are hard to reach, so you can get into those tight spaces.
Gotcha. You're going to be walking us through that process on my Jeep. So last week you did the oil change in my Jeep, demonstrated how you do that with a JK with a 3.6. But this week we're going to be walking through how to actually grease the chassis.
Yes.
And there's a lot more Zerks underneath my Jeep than there were when it actually came from the factory.
Yeah, that's right. And the more upgrades you do, or the different upgrades that you can do, require greasing at different points. It varies by brand. It varies by component. So if your factory tie rod is sealed, if you upgrade or you use a certain brand or a different brand, it may have grease fittings, Zerks. So each modified vehicle is different, and that makes it increasingly. I mean, you know your own vehicle, so especially if you do your own maintenance or you're going to attempt to do your own maintenance, you'll learn. But here in the shop, it varies so much. I mean, we have Jeeps and other off-road vehicles come in here that have grease fittings on their axles or on the drive shaft.
So like my aftermarket has a grease fitting on it.
Has a grease fitting on it. Well, the factory one, typically they don't. So,
and some aftermarkets don't have grease fittings either.
Some aftermarkets don't. Yep, that's exactly right. It is not necessarily component specific. It's manufacturer specific.
And depending on what you've done to your Jeep, every undercarriage is going to be different probably.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
Yep, they are different. You could have 2 or 3. Some Jeeps like yours will have several. So knowing where to look is the first step. So what we'll do when we're going through is, even if it's a spot where your Jeep may not have a fitting,
you're going to point it out.
We're going to point it all out. Just say, well, you could have one here. You could have one here. There's one here. There's one here. So if you're watching the video trying to learn how to lubricate your chassis and suspension, we don't want to drive people crazy going, I don't have a grease fitting there. So
that's okay. It's probably normal.
It's probably normal. Yep. It's probably normal.
Like I said, like my sway bar links, they're JKS quick disconnect links.
Yep. They have fittings. Yep. One at the top and one at the bottom.
Yeah.
So another thing that you want to watch for too, when you're doing your own maintenance, especially on things like sway bar links or things that are really exposed, is you also want to check the fitting itself.
So what am I looking for?
To make sure that it's not damaged, of course. Sometimes they shear off of there, they break.
Oh, okay, I got you.
Also, you want to watch for, there's a little check valve in there that when you put the grease gun fitting on and start pumping, that pushes that little pin in, and that's what allows the grease to go in through the fitting. If that gets clogged with dirt, mud, anything like that, you might be thinking that you're pumping grease in, but you're really not. And the telltale sign that you've got a blocked fitting is if after a pump or two on your grease gun, it starts coming out of the nozzle.
It kind of mushrooms outside the nozzle.
And it's not making it into. So that's so
it's either damaged or you don't have a good secure connection on there.
You may not have a good it's one of those two things. And you'll feel it click into place. You'll feel it kind of pop into place when you.
Now, if that's an issue and like there's actually a problem with the Zerk, is that something that can just be swapped out?
Yeah,
or do you have to replace the entire component?
No, you can swap. We have a big giant box full of different. I mean, there are different thread sizes. There are different fitting sizes, but thread sizes vary. But you can go to any auto parts store, order them online. You can get a package of 3, 5, 10, 15 fittings, different sizes.
Okay.
Keep those on hand in the garage. They're cheap. They're not very expensive. Okay. So if you're going to do your own maintenance, it's probably a good idea to have some extra grease fittings on the shelf.
Gotcha. So we're about ready to walk through that process on my Jeep. You're going to put on the lift behind me.
Yep.
and we're going to lift it up and you're going to point everything out to us. About how long does this process actually take from beginning to end and like we're using my Jeep, for example, which could have
yours is going to have a few more than average, but maybe 10 minutes tops.
10 minutes tops.
You know,
and that's with you actually going through pointing things out.
Without describing what you're doing and just doing it. 3, 4, 5 minutes maybe. But yeah, going through step by step and kind of explaining what we're doing. It's about 10 minutes.
Okay, and so just like an oil change, anyone can do it. This is another one of those things, regular maintenance that anyone can do in their driveway or in their garage.
Yes. Yep.
Awesome.
Sure can. So what we're going to do now is we're going to put Brantley's Jeep on the lift. If you haven't done so already, be sure and subscribe, hit that bell so you don't miss any of our future videos, and let's get rolling. Let's get it on the lift. All right, now we're going to grease the chassis on Brantley's Jeep. We're using a hand pump grease gun with multi-purpose grease. Any brand will work. It's typically red in color. So the number of grease fittings that you have will vary. For example, if you're running a stock Jeep, you may only have a handful. But if you start doing upgrades like your tie rod and upper and lower control arms, drive shaft, different manufacturers put grease fittings in different places. So in Brantley's case, he's got a whole bunch. Every part down here is upgraded. He's got a whole lot of grease fittings. So let's get started. We're going to start with a tie rod. When you're greasing, what I like to do is I like to start as you're facing the vehicle on the left side from the lowest point up, and then I like to go left to right. So we're going to start with the tie rod. You want to make sure that you get a good fit, and then you just start slowly squeezing. And it only takes anywhere from 1 to 3 pumps. And when you feel the trigger start to get tight, stop, because you've got enough in there. One of the most common problems people have is over greasing, and that can cause as many problems as not greasing at all. So this one's already pretty full. So we're only going to do about half a squeeze on that one. And the next one up is the lower ball joint. One good squeeze and it's already tight, so it's got a good amount of grease in there already. So now we're going to move on to the drag link. Same thing, we want to make sure we get a good tight, feel it snap into place. Give it a squeeze. There's 1, 2, still not quite getting tight enough yet. On the third one, it's really starting to get tight. So that's nice and tight with a lot of pressure. You don't want to overdo it, so we're going to stop right there. Next, we're going to move on to the upper ball joint. Now, as you can see, this one's got a little bit of filth on it. We want to clean that off before we start. Now that it's nice and cleaned off, you can grease the fitting. Okay, so that one's already about half a squeeze is all it took, and it was tight. So that means it was still pretty full from the last service. So as you can see on Brantley's Jeep, he's got a couple grease fittings on his sway bar links. So we're going to hit those. All right, one good squeeze, and it's already starting to get tight, so we're going to stop right there. All right, nice and tight right there. And you can see as it's starting to tighten up, that's as far as I'm going to squeeze. It just barely started coming out of the top. Clean it off, put the caps back on, because Brantley can't do anything like a normal human being. Did you make these purchases based on the number of grease fittings that they have? I mean, was that like a requirement? Like it has to have at least 15 grease fittings on it before I'm going to buy the damn thing? So we've already done the driver's side, which is a mirrored image of the passenger side. Now we're going to go underneath and hit his aftermarket drive shaft and U-joint. All right, so Brantley's got an aftermarket drive shaft, and on this particular one, there's a grease fitting right here at the top. We're going to hit that one. Okay, that one took about 2.5. And even though you can't see it, we'll get a close-up of it here in a minute. He's actually got a grease fitting right here on his U-joint. All right, that one's pretty full. And that should do it. And that's it. That's all the grease fittings on Brantley's Jeep. So thanks for watching. But before you go, let me tell you how you can win the Milwaukee Fuel 18-volt cordless half-inch impact gun. We want to get to 1,000 subscribers as soon as possible, and we need your help. If you're one of those first 1,000 subscribers, you will automatically be entered to win the Milwaukee 18-volt cordless impact gun. This thing has got over 1,400 pounds of torque, it's valued over $500, and it can be yours. Go ahead and subscribe and hit that bell so you don't miss one of our videos. And leave us a comment, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you everyone for watching. We'll see you on the next video.